Good day. We continue with limitations of we continue with economic growth. To measure economic growth, we measure it through the GDP. And when we talk about the GDP, it's the measurement of the PPC of a country, the output, the national income. We've talked about that in the previous class. Today we want to look into the limitations, the problems when we try using GDP to measure economic growth. The first one we need to talk about is inflation. Now, when we talk about inflation, inflation is a persistent rise in the price of goods and services. So, if the price of goods and services continue to increase in the country, the amount we pay will increase. The amount made by firms will also increase, yes or no? But does that really increase the output of that country? No. Output has not increased, but the price of goods and services has increased. Output is supposed to increase with relative amount of money made from them. So we used to produce 100, we continue to produce 100, but now the price for 100 has increased. Before now it was 2, now it is 3. So 300 will be made from producing the same unit of output. So there's inflation, which has increased the GDP, but it is not reflecting in growth of the country. Do you get the point or not? GDP is measured with output. So this country produces 100 units. This is what the country produces, 100 units of this. It used to sell each unit for 2. So producing 100, selling for 2 makes 200, right or not? So that means the GDP for this country as of right now is 200. But there's inflation. Price increased to 3 for each. As soon as price increased to 3, and you're still producing 100, as the economy grow, as it grow, the economy no. Because the output has not increased, but the price of goods and services has increased. So it is misleading. So you would think the GDP of the country is increasing, but it has not increased. It is only the price of goods and services that increase, not the quantity produced. That is inflation, which is misleading.
How does inflation happen?
So what?
How does inflation happen?
Inflation could happen. It could be an increase in demand. An increase in demand, high cost of production. There are different reasons why we could have inflation. Demand might increase, and if demand increases, price is expected to increase. Cost of production might increase. Maybe cost of importation. Maybe the country needs to import raw materials. So high cost of importation might bring about inflation. High taxes might bring about inflation. So there's a percentage rise in the price of goods and services, but it does not reflect in the output of the country. The amount of GDP has increased based on the fact that prices has increased, but not output. That's the first problem. Do we get it? So how do we solve this problem? To solve this problem, we have to adjust inflation with GDP. So that is why we call it real GDP. So inflation has to be adjusted with, GDP has to be adjusted with inflation. So we're not going to use the nominal GDP. The nominal GDP is the value we have. But now whatever we have to calculate, whenever we have to calculate GDP, we calculate it with the inflation rate. That is the solution. Then we have real GDP instead of nominal GDP. Is it clear? The problem is inflation. To solve the problem, you adjust inflation with the GDP. Is it clear? Yes. Any question about that?
How can you adjust GDP?
With the inflation rate. What is the inflation rate? Oh, 1.5%. What is the GDP rate? 2.5%. Then you calculate it together. Clear? The second problem is population. Population might increase. So if there is increase in population, as a result, there's increase in population and at the same time there's increase in GDP. It becomes difficult for us to calculate it because we don't know how much people have come in or how much people have left the country. So to calculate GDP, you don't use population to calculate it because you might not get a tangible figure. So you use GDP per capita. Do you get the point I'm making here? Population might be difficult to relate. You might find it difficult to relate population with the GDP value. So because it is difficult, then we calculate GDP, we calculate the growth rate with GDP per capita. GDP divided by the number of people in the country. We talked about that yesterday. We talked about GDP per capita and GDP. The GDP of Libya is not the same as the GDP of Nigeria. The GDP of Nigeria is higher than the GDP of Libya. But this is because of the population. So for us to understand the GDP per capita, for us to calculate based on the numbers of people in the country. We need to calculate through the GDP per capita. And that would actually give us a figure that can be used to compare Libya with Nigeria, not GDP. Because GDP at that point in time might be misleading. Is it clear?
Yes.
The next one, statistical error. These are figures, right? They are numbers, they are figures. They are collected. So in the course of collecting these data or these figures, we might make mistakes. We are human, we can make mistakes. Yes or no? So for one mistake, it means the value we put together is inaccurate. This can be solved using information technology. But you have to put in mind that whatever we talk about technology, it's still an input. There's always going to be a single entry. Computer will not just start working. Individuals will make computer work. Yes or no? So in the course of you imputing them, you might have imputed the wrong figure. Do we get it? That's about statistical error. So if you have to get it right the first time, and that is so difficult. So if it is not right the first time, it might be inaccurate. So that means the GDP figure we have is not accurate. Do you get the point? The next one, the value of home-produced goods. Some goods are produced. We call them, we have